All right, so today we're going to move to our last unit, which we're only going to get through part of, which is getting ready for Algebra 1. Today we're going to talk about combining like terms and solving equations. This is one of those things that you have to be able to do next year in Algebra 1. So the first thing we're going to talk about is like terms. Okay, so like terms are, I guess we could say, expressions that have the same variable. Okay, so for example, something like 3x and 5x. Those are like terms because they both have the variable of x. If I had 2w and 7w, those would be like terms because they both have w's. If I had a number like 4 and a number like 50, those would be like terms because they don't have any variables. So they are similar, or they're what we call like terms. All right, so the next section, or the next question says circle, box, or underline different sets of like terms. I have colored pencils, so I'm going to do them in terms of color. So if I have a 20 negative, what other terms are like terms? Well, the next one has an x, so that's not a like term. Y, we've got an x, but I do see an 11 here. Those are like terms. Going to the next row, we've got a -6 that has a y, so that doesn't work, but that 8 is just a number. 5x has an x, so that doesn't work, but then the 2 does. So all 4 of those would be considered like terms. All right, so the next one is 10x. So I've got 10x, so I'm looking for other variables with, or other terms with x's. So I see a -4x, I see a -6y, so that doesn't work. I see a 5x, and then I also see a 7x. So all of those are what we call like terms. The last one, I have a 3y here, so I'm going to just underline that one. I've got 3y. I also have a -6y. So those would be considered like terms as well. Okay, so when we combine like terms, which is what we're going to look at to one of the things we're going to look at today, you are just adding or subtracting those numbers depending upon what the equation or what the problem says. So if you look for like terms here, I've got a 12x and then I've got a positive 2x. So I've got to take that 12x and I've got to take that positive 2x and I got to add them together. So that gives me 14x. Okay, and then if I look at the other set of numbers, I've got a -3 and a -11. That gives me -14. So that would be my final expression because I'm not solving. There's no equal sign. So that would be what I would end up with when I simplified them by combining like terms. All right, if we look at letter B, I've got a -7y and I've got a positive 12y. So I've got a -7 and a positive 12. Use your calculator if you need to. That gives us 5y's. Okay, so if I look at what I have left, I've got a +3 and a -5. +3 and -5 are both like terms. That gives me -2. All right, in letter C, I've got -3m and a -2m. So since they're both negative, that's -5m. Okay, and then if I look at the rest of it, I've got a +5, a +11, and a +7. So 5 plus 11 is 16. 16 plus 7 is 23. All right, the next one, those parentheses should look familiar. That just means I have to first distribute. So 4 times 2w is 8w. 4 times 6 is +24. And then -11. Now it looks just like those last problems. 8w has no other like term, so that just stays 8w. But then I've got a +24 and a -11. So 24 minus 11 is a +13. And again, feel free to use your calculators if you need to. Next one, again, I've got to distribute. So that gives me -12x and then a -9. -3 times +3 is -9. And then +11x. So just like in the last problem, I've got to find my like terms. I've got a -12x and a +11x. So that gives me a -1x. And then I've got a -9 because there are no other like terms with that one. Okay, remember that I could also just call it -x minus 9. Either of those answers would be acceptable. All right, if we take a look at letter F, which is our last one like this, notice that it just looks a little bit bigger. So I start with a 2x. I've got to distribute here, which gives me -4x, and then negative and a negative gives me +20. I've also got to distribute the 3, so 3 times 2x is 6x, and 3 times negative 1 is negative 3. Now it's just a matter of combining my like terms. I've got a 2x, a negative 4x, and a 6x. So 2 minus 4 is negative 2x. Negative 2x plus 6 gives me positive 4x. And then I've got to go ahead and combine my 20 and my negative 3. 20 minus 3 is just positive 17. So again, notice that none of these are answers, x equals 5, x equals 2. Because there's no equal sign, you're just simplifying or combining the like terms. All right, and then the last thing we're going to look at is combining like terms and then solving some equations. So we've definitely solved equations this year. We haven't done a ton with combining like terms, but that should be something you're familiar with from middle school. But the first thing we're going to do when we solve is we need to combine like terms on both sides of the equal sign. So remember, some of you draw that little line there from middle school. We cannot cross over that equal sign without doing inverse operations. If it's addition, subtract. If it's subtraction, add. If it's multiply, divide. If it's division, we got to multiply. So on the left side, I notice that we've got two like terms. So our first step is to combine those like terms. So negative 2 and positive 4 is positive 2. So now I've got x minus 2 equals 11. To get x all by itself, I need to get rid of that positive 2. So I want to do minus 2 to both sides. That's its inverse operation. So x is equal to 9. All right, so again, if you want to draw that little line there, if you take a look at the left side, notice we've got two like terms there. So negative 3w and negative 2w gives us negative 5w, and that's equal to negative 20. To get w alone, we've got to do the opposite or the inverse. This is a multiplication sign in between them. It's negative 5 times w, so I have to do the opposite, and I've got to divide by negative 5. So I get w equals positive 4. And again, most of you are pretty good at solving equations. We just have to combine like terms first. Okay, so if you look at letter C, again, looking for like terms, you notice that you've got a 4x and a 5x. They're both positive. So when I add those together, that gives me 9x. And then we also have an 11, which is positive, right? There's a plus sign in front of there realistically. It's a positive 11, and that has to equal 20. Okay, again, we got to first get that 9x by itself. So that means we need to move that 11 to the other side, and we do that by subtracting. So that gives me 9x equals 9. Now remember, there's a multiplication sign in between there, so the opposite of multiply is to divide. So I divide both sides by 9, and we get x equals 1. All right, if you look at letter D, on the left side, the first term has a y, and the second term doesn't have a y. So there's no like terms on the left side, so we don't have anything to combine. But remember, our first step is to get the variable all by itself. So that means I need to get rid of that minus 2 by doing plus 2 to both sides. That gives me y divided by 3 equals 13. Okay, so remember, we solve these equations by always doing the opposite or the inverse. Now we've got some division here. The opposite of divide is to multiply, so I've got to multiply both sides by 3. If it's a 3 over 1, those 3's reduce, so I'm just left with y on the left side, and then I get 39. Remember, we can always check our answers by plugging that number back in for y. So if I were to just check it real quick, I get 39 divided by 3 and then minus 2. 39 divided by 3 is 13. 13 minus 2 is 11. So that checks. Okay, I'm not going to require you to check your answers. However, it's always a good idea, especially on quizzes or tests, to just plug it back in and check. Letter E, again, looking at that left side, I've got a negative 5x and a 4. Neither of those are like terms, so there's nothing that I can combine there. I want to get that negative 5x all by itself, so we need to move that 4 to the other side. So I'm going to subtract 4 over. That gives me negative 5x equals negative 15. And again, there's a multiplication sign in the middle of those. Opposite of multiply is to divide, so divide both sides by negative 5, and we get x equals 3. Again, you can check your answers if you want by plugging it back in, but that is not something that I'm going to require. All right, letter F has some parentheses, so we need to distribute just like we did on the first page. So I get 6x minus 12 equals 24. Again, I'm going to draw in, that line, so we cannot cross there. There are no like terms on the left side because I've got a negative or a positive 6x and then just a negative 12. So we got to get that 6x by itself. So I'm going to add 12 to both sides since it was a minus 12. So I get 6x equals 36. And again, just like we did in the last one, if it's multiplication, the opposite of multiply is to divide. So 36 divided by 6 is just 6. All right, last two problems. They look a little bit trickier, and it's just because there's a little bit more work that goes into it. So just like with the last problem, we've got to distribute. Negative 2 times 5 is negative 10x. Negative 2 times negative 1 gives me positive 2. And then I get 6 times 2, which is 12x, and then 6 times negative 5, which is negative 30, and that's equal to 10. So that has a lot more on the left-hand side, so I've got to combine some like terms. I've got a negative 10x and a positive 12. 12 minus 10 gives me 2x. I've also got a positive 2 and a negative 30. That gives me negative 28, and that's equal to 10. So just like we did in the last problem, I need to get that 2x all by itself. So since it's a minus 28, I'm going to add 28 to both sides. So that gives me 2x equals 38. And since this is multiplication, I'm going to go ahead and divide. And now I get x equals 19. Okay, I'll tell you right now, all of these numbers were nice numbers. You may get some decimals. It shouldn't be anything too crazy. But don't just assume that everything has to be a nice whole number. All right, so the last problem that we're going to do for today is letter H. So just like the last problem, we've got to distribute that 5. So we get 15x minus 5. Now be careful here. I've got to distribute a negative 10. So negative 10 times 2 gives me negative 20x. Negative 10 times 1 gives me negative 10. And that's equal to 20. Okay, so taking a look at the left side, we've got to combine our like terms. I've got a 15 and a negative 20x. 15 minus 20 gives me negative 5x's. And then if I look over here, I've got a negative 5 and a negative 10. That gives me negative 15 when I add those together. And that's equal to 20. All right, so we've got to get that 5x by itself. So I'm going to add 15 to both sides, which gives me negative 5x equals 35. And just like we did on a bunch of the other problems, there is multiplication in the middle, so we need to divide. And I end up getting x equals negative 7. So that is combining like terms and then solving equations where you actually have to combine like terms sometimes. Please be very careful with your positives and negatives. That's usually where mistakes happen. So if you need to use a calculator, that's fine. Have that off to the side so that when you're doing those, you don't have any issues with your positives and negatives. I'm going to have a Zoom on Thursday if you need any extra help. Or you're welcome to email me and I can set up something tomorrow or today, I guess, which would be Tuesday. If you've got any questions, again, just please reach out to me and let me know. Thanks and have a great day.